Very good. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Our Corinne Truth Center Baha'i History Book Club has almost 210 members from many countries, and we're so pleased that so many of you have joined us today. Earl, thank you especially so much for agreeing to come and talk with us about your book, Agnes Baldwin Alexander, Hand of the Cause of God, which we have been reading this month. On a personal note, Ms. Alexander visited the Philippines when I was a little girl. So I had the bounty of meeting her, but I don't remember very much from her visit. You'll see in my background, I've added a photograph of Ms. Alexander with my father, Hand of the Cause of God, Dr. Mohajer, and their auxiliary board member, Mr. Umegai, in Japan in 1965. So I wanted to highlight my connection with her, my personal connection with her. So let's start our session by reading the first tablet to Agnes Alexander from Abdu'l-Baha. It's on page 36 of the book, and Louis Burnett will kindly read it for us. Thank you.
O thou maidservant of God, the tongues have spoken of thy attraction to God, and the pens testified of thy burning by the fire of the love of God. Indeed, the heart of Abdu'l-Baha approveth of this, because it feeleth its heat from this distant and blessed spot. O maidservant of God, by God, the truth, the Spirit of Christ from the supreme concourse doth in every time and aspect announce to thee this great good news. Be therefore a divine bird, proceed to thy native country, spread the wings of sanctity over those spots, and sing and chant and celebrate the name of thy Lord, that thou mayest gladden the supreme concourse and make the seeking souls hasten unto thee, as the moths hasten to the lamp, and thus illumine that distant country by the light of God. Unto thee be salutations and praise.
Thank you so much. And as we see in this beautiful book, Miss Alexander actually fulfilled everything that Abdu'l-Baha had asked her to do. So let me start with a quick introduction to Earl Redman. Rob Stockman will do a fuller introduction to him. Earl has authored many books, including 5 books about the impressions of the pilgrims visiting Abdu'l-Baha and Shobi Effendi. He lives in Ireland. Let me also introduce Robert Stockman, who's the director of the Corinne Truth Center, and all the work that we do in the book club is carried out under his loving support and guidance. You've heard me say that I've known Rob for many years, and I'm really enjoying working with him in this capacity. So Earl, we'll start with questions about your background and motivation for writing about Hand of the Cause of God, Agnes Alexander. Then we'll talk about her life, and how we should think about her life in order to motivate ourselves for the service of the 9-year plan. And then we'll open it up for questions from all of our book club members. So Rob, let me hand it over to you right away. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know how I got muted. Thanks, Gisu, for introducing me, and thank you, Earl, for your fascinating book that's extremely important for filling out our history of an important part of the development of the faith in the world, because Agnes Alexander was one of the people who really opened China, Japan, and Korea, and not to mention Hawaii. So really, I think her contribution is extremely important, and I'm really grateful that we finally have it written down, and in print, and I think that will be of an important contribution, as I said, to Baha'i history. Why don't you give us a little background about how you became an author and sort of what stimulated you to start on this particular path as an author?
Well, it was totally by accident.
Ah.
I was on pilgrimage in 2007, and we went to the house of the master, and you go into his bedroom, and I sat in the corner where it was nice and quiet on the floor, and I started to say my prayers, and I thought 5 minutes later, I opened my eyes, there's nobody in the room. And I went out and everybody was leaving the building. It had been 45 minutes, not 5 minutes. And I was kind of lost in that time period, but that's kind of developed this fascination with Abdu'l-Bahá from that point on. So when the Baha'i World News Service sent out a notice that 100 years previously, Abdu'l-Bahá had left the Holy Land, I said, well, I want to read a book about what he did. And I went out and looked and found out there wasn't any book. There was a bunch of books, had bits and pieces of it. And so I started gathering stories together, never expecting to ever write a book. I was just gathering for my own thing, and I did some stuff at summer schools and winter schools with it, but that was all I expected it to be until I got about 200 pages of this stuff, all kind of connected with my own words for my own interest. And I got this pressure from a couple Irish people to send it to George Ronald.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they always kind of looked as being one of the pinnacles. If you're a Baha'i author, to have published through George Ronald was kind of a high spot. And they rather amazed me by immediately saying they were publishing it, and 5 months later I had a copy in my hand.
Wow.
And it all went from there. I made a mistake in one of the references, and it was in Star of the West, which at that point was not digitized. And all I had was paper books, so I'm going page by page. I didn't know whether volume or page or whatever was wrong. And I started seeing all these fascinating stories about Abdu'l-Bahá and people wanting to ask questions, but he answered them before they asked them. And so that became the 2 Visiting Abdu'l-Bahá volumes, and it just kind of grew from there. I never planned any of this.
Well, we're so grateful that you got interested in doing this research, because these are the kinds of stories that really help inspire people and help build their identity as Baha'is and their devotion to the faith. So thank you very much for putting these books together. They I'm sure have really moved a large number of people and been very helpful for a large number of people. I gather that this book has been sort of in the research phase, shall we say, for 40 years, maybe. I can remember talking to Dwayne about it a long time back and his interest in completing his research. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about the research and the writing process that brought the book out for us.
Well, this is one of those things that was really kind of weird because I didn't do hardly any research for this. Dwayne did it all. He sent me a little thumb drive with, I don't know how many gigabytes, 120 gigabytes of stuff on it, and it had everything there. I think the only thing I added was a couple things when I discovered that she'd gone to Alaska. I started asking around whether he had anything on that, and he thought he remembered something, but he basically made all the contacts with Hawaii, and they got me some letters that explained her trip to Alaska. Not from a Baha'i standpoint, unfortunately, but because they were written to her parents who were not Baha'is. But he did all the hard work. All I had to do is sit there and put it in order and then write. And, so that I consider that the easy part. The research is always the hardest part. So, but actually, you can probably blame Erica Toussaint for writing these books, because I hadn't written biographies before. And I went to visit her. We were on our way to the Pacific to do our storytelling. And she said, stop by Portland. So we did. And she started telling me all about Howard Colby Ives.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd never done a biography before and didn't know if I wanted to do one, but she gave me all this stuff. And when I started looking at it, I found it really quite exciting and inspiring. And it was right after that I decided I could do that, maybe, that Dwayne got in touch, and all of a sudden I was writing 2 biographies at the same time. It was really kind of a strange situation.
Fantastic. That's really quite a blessing to have the research already available and somebody looking for assistance to get it all organized and put down into print form. Do we know anything about Agnes Alexander's papers? I gather that there was some question of whether they could be quoted or not. I know Dwayne was concerned about that because there was a whole question of whether her brothers and sisters or their descendants were literary heirs or something.
Hmm.
Do you know anything about that?
No, we never talked about that. He just sent me this stuff and said, write it up. And I never really knew that there was much that could be the problem with it.
Yeah, I don't know that there is, because
Most all the stuff was stuff that he collected and he got from the Baha'i archives. So I guess he just assumed that since it was in the Baha'i archives in Hawaii, then it was publicly available.
Yeah, there's a good chance I think that that's probably true as well. So far you have written 6 books, which is really, and in how many years have you written the 6 books?
Well, the first one came out in 2011.
6 books in basically 5 years.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Of course, it helps have someone else with doing some of the research. Probably takes a good year and a half to write a good book when you include the research, or 2 years. So, but still, that's fantastic. Abdu'l-Baha in Their Midst was one of them. 2 volumes about Shoghi Effendi Through the Pilgrim's Eye, a book about the Knights of Baha'u'llah, 2 volumes titled Visiting Abdu'l-Baha about the pilgrims who visited him. And of course, now we have the biography of Agnes Alexander and the biography of Howard Colby Ives and his wife. And you also contributed to the Baha'i Community of the British Isles, 1844 to 1963, which was published back in September. And I gather you're now working on a book about the Apostles of Baha'u'llah for George Ronald.
Well, Hooper Dunbar once asked me if I was doing anything, and I said I wasn't. So he said I should look into the apostles and disciples. And of course, Mr. Dunbar tells you something, you do it. So I looked into them, found them really quite fascinating. And that was quite a few years ago. I wrote that one now, but it finally came up to the top of the list. And George Ronald promptly split it into 2 things. I think they decided my books are too big. So they split it in 2 books. So right now we're almost through the editing process for Apostles, and we'll start the Disciples later on. And I won't tell you about all the other books I've inundated them with. I've got quite a few more that they have waiting on their list.
Great. Excellent. Well, we will await that those additional contributions with great excitement. Have you any advice you could offer aspiring writers?
That's kind of a hard thing because I didn't really start writing books, but when I started doing it, it all comes down to look at what's if you're offered something, like in the case of Dwayne and Erica Toussaint. I initially didn't want to do them until I saw the information they collected, and all of a sudden you start finding there's a lot of fascinating history out there. And I've made 3 trips to Wilmette, and you start digging into what they have in their archives, and all of a sudden you realize there are a lot of people who have amazing stories. And so then it just goes by whatever intrigues you. Like, being from Alaska, I'm quite familiar with what went on up there. And you have Imogene Hogue, and she and Mary and Jack spent 8 months traveling by paddle wheel steamer up the Yukon River in 1919. And so I thought that would be interesting to look into. And of course, I know most all the places they've been to. I've been to most of them. Uh, so that becomes something that you start chasing down. I grew up in the American West, was all over the place, and so Isabella Brittingham got to be of interest. And so it's just kind of whatever excites you, whatever interests you, or whatever somebody suggests that maybe you should look into. That's another one.
What sort of writing experience did you have before starting on these books?
Well, I was a geologist. I had to write lots of reports. So, and I had some pretty good people I worked with who were very good editors, and they really taught me a lot about how to write, how to be concise, um, keep it to the point and make it interesting. I've also just liked to write. I've just always written stuff. Some of my letters my parents have saved are really quite interesting, looking back when I was writing as a teenager. So I guess just, writing stuff it's how I understand things. Like when I was started off with the Abdu'l-Baha in their midst, I had all these stories I was collecting, but I wanted to understand how they fit together. So I started putting them in chronological order, and then had to explain how he got from this point to that point, and that's how it all developed.
Very good. Excellent. Well, I'll turn everything now over to Gisu so that she can ask you some specific questions about the book itself.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot, Earl. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Yeah.
Before I turn to the life of Agnes Alexander, I have a question for both Earl and Rob, which is, how do you know when you've done enough research? Because you can always do more. There's always something else out there. So how do you know when you've done enough and can say, now I'm going to sit down and write?
You don't. At least that's my answer. Yeah,
Yeah, me too.
yeah.
I just got something triggered me to start writing.
Hmm.
I started writing.
Yeah. No, you start digging into stuff. You have a certain amount of stuff, and like we've got a really extensive library here, so I can really jump into things quite quickly. But then you start realizing there's big holes and gaps and things that need explanation that you don't have. And then that's when the real research starts to happen, and you're on the internet, and I'm booking airplane tickets to Wilmette or wherever I need to go to get the information. So yeah, it's research is kind of an interesting thing. It's an ongoing thing, and George Rondel long ago learned that uh, whenever a book comes up of mine comes up for the editing process, they have to ask me for the latest draft. It is definitely not the one I sent them first to look at, because I'm always finding stuff.
That's so interesting. It was easy at school because there was a deadline. So when you had, you know, enough time to start writing, then you sat down and wrote because you were up against your deadline. But it's very different, I think, for Baha'i authors who can always find more interesting things. Let's turn to this fantastic book and the life of Ms. Alexander. So, you know, I know you're a wonderful storyteller, Earl. So tell us what you think are the highlights of her life.
Well, so I looked at that, and I started thinking about it, and one of the first highlight I had was when she encountered the faith, courtesy of her father, who basically told her to go see her relatives in Italy, and that put her in the same pension as pilgrims coming back. And of course, she saw the light in their faces, and that's where she encountered the faith. So to me, that was a really big point. Um, and then when she was on her way to Japan, but she was in Europe, and the First World War happened. And this is where she really was constantly using divine assistance, and she believed in it thoroughly. And that story is really good because it tells all these things. Like her trunk was in Germany. She didn't know how she could get it. It was the only trunk that came back from Germany. She didn't think she could make it down to Marseille where the boat was, but she managed to get through on the train. Then she couldn't get boat tickets, but she got boat tickets, and she always expected these things. So to me, that's really a high point because that shows where she was really starting to understand that divine assistance is something you really count on and work on. And the next one is uh, when she was in Japan, and an English Baha'i and some friends came over, and it was recommended they go to this Buddhist festival in Kobe. And she went there, and of course, there was only one person in the whole place who spoke English, Dayun Inoue. And of course, he became a Baha'i, and he was the one who translated Esselmont's book into Japanese. So that was a really big point. And of course, her trips to Korea in 1921 and China with Martha Root in 1923 were really big things. And pilgrimage, of course, was a high point. Returning to Japan was also another big high point, and some of the people she met on that part. Becoming an auxiliary board member, 54, Hand of the Cause, 57. The Hand of the Cause, I thought, was something that was really quite fascinating because I've read about a lot of what Hands of the Cause did when they were not appointed Hands of the Cause. Everything from Bill Sears hiding under a blanket, and Enoch Olinga laying himself flat on the floor. Uh, she basically said, "Why me?" But then she said, Shoghi Effendi is infallibly guided. If he's infallibly guided, then I have to be a hand of the cause. And she went to work. So, and just the whole thing about relying on divine inspiration, because there's a fair number of cases where she would be inspired to do something. So she would do it. And after she'd done it, she would get a letter from either Abdul Baha or Shoghi Effendi saying, do what you just did. So it was written before she'd done it, but arrived after she'd done it. So she had this really deep connection spiritually with both Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi. I think those were the main high points I thought of.
Yeah, she was incredible. I mean, opening up the faith in all of these countries and her travel. I mean, just incredible. And she had some very special strengths and qualities and gifts. I mean, if you think of a single young woman opening up, the faith in Hawaii and Japan, traveling in China. I mean, it's just in Korea, it's incredible. So what were these gifts in your view that made her so successful? I'm asking this question because our book club is to try to figure out how we can learn from and emulate these people to better serve the 9-year plan. So in your view, what are these qualities that we could emulate? You already mentioned her absolute reliance on divine assistance.
Well, the one I like to think of in relation to people like her are, we have the quotation of, "We want to be a hollow reed from which the pith of self hath been blown." And that's so that we can be a conduit for whatever comes. I also have a letter from Abdu'l-Baha that says, whenever you start to speak about the faith, don't think. In other words, just say what you're inspired to say. That was one of her biggest strengths. She completely got herself out of the way. I think that was the most powerful thing she would do. When she would get in any situation, she would just let Abdu'l-Baha talk through her. And so, I mean, she studied like crazy, all the writings, so she knew things backwards and forwards. But if you don't have it in there, they can't, the concourse can't kick it out where you can use it. But I think that was the biggest thing she had, was that she got herself completely out of the way and let the concourse help her.
You had mentioned that she became an auxiliary board member and then a hand of the cause. She became a board member when she was 79 years old and a hand of the cause when she was 82. And we've studied other people. For example, Corinne herself was older when she became a hand of the cause, and it kind of dramatically increased her service at that point. What are your thoughts about Miss Alexander?
Well, like I said, she decided that since she had been appointed, it had to be good because Shoghi Effendi was infallibly guided. So she just realized that she could do it. She had no doubts. And I think that's one of the biggest things. People have doubts, but when you start getting divine assistance over and over again, you don't even think about it anymore. It just happens. I can kind of sympathize a little bit in these books because I start working on a book and I run into roadblocks. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, somebody contacts me with something about what I was thinking about. Or something else comes up and I'm led to something else. So the concourse is out there. And like Shoghi Effendi said, they're arrayed in serried ranks, just waiting for us to arise. They can't arise until we arise. And I think she really understood that. So knowing that they're all up there, I think that's what really gave her all the extra strength to go do things. She figured if I'm supposed to do this, they'll help me do it.
Amazing. Just what a wonderful woman. Do you have a favorite story from the book? I know you have many, but is there one or two in particular that you could read for us?
Well, I thought about that, and there's a number of things, but I guess the one that kind of came back, there was a couple of, when she met Mr. Zenimoto was one, but the one that keeps coming back to me was when she was in Switzerland and World War I starts, and all of the assistance she got. To me, that was really quite an amazing story. So it isn't exactly short, it's a couple pages long, but
We'd love to hear it.
this will be a first. I've never read from one of my books before. And all our storytelling, Sharon does the reading and I just yammer away. So anyway, I'll see if I can read this thing. World War I started in 28 July while Agnes was in Verita, Switzerland. And suddenly she had to change her plans. But she had a big problem with her baggage, which consisted of a trunk. She wrote, "My trunk was sent ahead of me by slow freight to Stuttgart." It went to Almendobloch. And not to be there in the station. On August 1st, I mailed the key and receipt to a lady living in Stuttgart, asking her to keep the trunk for me. I've heard nothing. A week ago, a girl here wrote in German for me, and then the consul telegraphed with no answer. Then Agnes needed money to travel and walked a long way to the bank. but because she could not remember the name of the proprietor of her pension, they would not give her the funds. She said, I was caught. All communication was cut off, and I only had enough money to pay my board, but not my railway fare to go to Geneva. And they said the train to go to Geneva will be the last one that Sunday, as the soldiers, they needed to use the trains. And so I had to get very brave because I was very timid and asked to borrow money. There was a professor from the Geneva University who loaned me the money. They were going, and I went, and I got to Geneva. When Agnes arrived in Geneva, the mysterious hand of God was at play. Agnes wrote, through prayer, I was led to come to Geneva and some French people who have wonderfully cared for me. I came to see the American consul, and he has been my best friend, but I was not able to cash my money until after I received this tablet. O thou my dear daughter, thy letter was received. It imparted great happiness. Praise be to God that thy dear daughter is sacrificing herself in the path of Baha'u'llah and enduring every difficulty. It is now more advisable for thee to depart directly to Japan, and while there, be engaged in the diffusion of the fragrances of God. From there thou mayest return to India, and from India to the Holy Land. Today the greatest of all divine bestowals is teaching the cause of God, for it is fraught with confirmation. Every teacher is confirmed and is favored at the divine threshold. In the estimation of the ideal king, the army which is in the front of the battlefield is encircled with the glances of his mercifulness, and the sight of the divine farmer. The sower of the seed is accepted and favored. I hope that thou mayest be like a realm-conquering army and a farmer. Therefore, voyage to Japan is preferred to everything else. Still, thou art free. So Agnes received this tablet on 22 August. She never did manage to get to pilgrimage until 1937, so it was quite a while. Then in a letter written on September 6th, Agnes described the miracle of what happened next. My trunk was in Stuttgart, which had gone before me from Milan. I was ready, though, to go to Japan without it. As Abdu'l-Bahá wrote, thy voyage to Japan is preferred to everything. Everyone here said it was impossible for me to get my trunk, but I knew it was a spiritual power they did not count on. I supplicated Abdu'l-Bahá, if it was his will, that I might get it. In a few days, I had it. It was wonderful proof of the power of the center of the covenant. Consul Keene telegraphed for me, and it came. I felt I had to fall on my knees and thank God. It was truly wonderful. Then all my money affairs were arranged, and I can easily go to Japan. When Abdu'l-Bahá wishes us to do anything and we are ready, the means are also ready. And to me, that kind of sums up in a nutshell her outlook. Now I am only waiting for the steamer. I hope to sail September 19th from Marseille. You may know I am eager to do his bidding. You see, dear, as I have felt and once dreamed, as I told you, it is not time for me to go to Abdu'l-Bahá, and I have found the fact that I have not seen him to aid my teaching. That is not necessary. It is only faith that counts. I thank God for his wonderful love and mercy to me, that I am permitted to go forth. And dear, never forget that you share in everything with me. Agnes was told that hers was the only piece of baggage that came through. She had not been too worried because Abdu'l-Bahá had used the word favored, that every teacher is favored. He mentioned it twice. Then the communication opened with London. I was able to get the money from London. And then it had accumulated and I had money to go to Japan. So in spite of Agnes's success, everything else was chaos around her. Many others were having great difficulties with lost luggage and great problems getting money. Through the aid of the American consul, she was able to have her money draft cashed. Today I got all my money cashed. I have $1,600 from the cashing hut. I am thankful to have money. The consulate people are certainly kind in every way. They have been simply deluged with people from morning till night, and even Sunday, people coming in the hundreds to get trains to Paris and go away. So in Geneva, Agnes found the P&O Steamship Company had a ship going directly to Yokohama from Marseille on 19 September. It would stop in Port Said, Colombo, Sri Lanka, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Kobe before reaching Yokohama. But another problem suddenly blocked her path. I couldn't get passage. There was a German cruiser in the Mediterranean Ocean torpedoing steamers, and so all the steamers had stopped going through. But only the Japanese steamer went through. And this steamer was filled in London before it left. And so I sent a cable to the head office in London, but no result. And then I wrote to the American consul in Marseille where the steamer would stop, and he wrote back, "There's no passage before November." And then at the last resort, I wrote a personal letter to the agent in Marseille and said, if he could get me on the steamer, I would accept anything. Then I didn't know anything further to do. And I was praying a prayer of the Bob, is there any remover of difficulty save God? But that was my last resort. There was nothing more that I knew I could do. And there was a knock on the door, and I was handed a telegram, and it was from this agent. He said if I would telegraph and come immediately, he'd get me on the steamer. Then he told me that he could not take a trunk, and that the trains were being used for the French soldiers who were wounded, that they would be taken to southern France. Sometimes the passengers were being left at places where there was no food and all these things, which is true. But the American consul says, you try, you speak French, you go and try. So I did. I checked my trunk and it went through to Marseille. All the stations where we stopped, I saw soldiers and nurses, and I went to get the visa from the American consul. And I told him I had come and I had brought my trunk, and I was going to sail the next day. And he said, you can never get your trunk. You can never get a trunk through. I went to the hotel and it was already there in the hotel. Then I went to see the agent about my passage. I told him I would accept anything if he got me on the steamer. Well, he said there was a German lady 6 months before who had bought her passage, but France and Germany were at war. And he said, I will give you her place, and if she comes, I can have her arrested. So the next time I was in Germany, I told the Baha'is that one of their countrymen who helped me go to Japan. So only Agnes and a French lady, Madame Kossouli, boarded the steamer. Mademoiselle Kossouli boarded the steamer. And they both shared the same unfortunate German stateroom. Agnes said it wasn't an elegant stateroom, but there wasn't a better one on the steamer. And although I'd be willing to go steerage, and not only that, she became a Baha'i. It was God's plan on that voyage. So I've just always kind of liked that story because it just shows that she just truly believed in divine assistance, and when she needed it, it came.
And as you were reading, I was thinking that how persistent she was. She
Mhm.
knew it would work, but she also kept trying and this way, that way, every possible way to
Mhm.
fulfill the wishes of Abdu'l-Baha and get herself to Japan, accepting any hardship without luggage, any position they gave her. I mean, really, really remarkable. And there's so many beautiful stories like that. Having written the book, and knowing that we are reading these books to see how we can better serve, how did her story and her life inspire your own service?
Well, I think it's what we've been talking about, just realizing that the concourse is up there. But before it can do anything to help us, we have to arise. Like my wife likes to say, there are no divine couch potatoes. You have to get off that couch. So if you start to move, even if you go in the wrong direction, we have a good story about some friends of ours she went on a 3-day visit to the Holy Land and stayed for 5 years and got married while she was there. And then they pioneered. They knew they had to pioneer, and they pioneered to Africa. And they had amazing things. They had all these Hands of the Cause staying with them and a House of Justice members staying with them and great experiences, but they kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And they realized if they stayed much longer, somebody was going to die. So they decided to pioneer again to where she was from, which was Chile. And so they moved to Chile. The doors just slammed open when they got there. And they realized that the desire to go pioneering was the right one. Africa was the wrong decision. But they got all these bounties. So God is able to guide them to the right path, uh, one way or the other. So I think it's once you're moving, God can change your path if you get on the wrong one. He'll send you back to the right one. And I think that's what Agnes really understood. Whatever she was doing, she would just charge ahead, figuring that if she was supposed to do it, God would make it happen. And I think to me that's the thing we can all take away. The concourse is up there. It's ready to help. And we just have to expect have to believe that, I guess.
So beautiful. So beautiful. Thank you so much. I know our book club members have lots and lots of wonderful questions for you. So let me turn it back to Rob to guide us through the conversation.
Good. Thank you, Gisu. I don't see any questions yet, but I'm hoping that we will get some very quickly here. Mary McCoskey has her hand up. Are we trying to turn on people's microphones, though? Oh, I guess we can, of course. Of course. So go ahead, Mary. And
Hello. I just love this book, and I love the story of the trunk. It was amazing. I'm so glad you told it. And I also notice how everything happened in her face.
Mhm.
Charlotte Dixon saw something in her face. She said, "I see by your face that you know Christ has returned." And then when she went to Paris and entered May Bowles' apartment, someone whispered, "Is she a Baha'i?"
Mhm.
And somebody else said, "Just look at her face." There's a lot in the book about light in the face.
Mhm.
But my question is, what is the story about that codicil to the will, which
Mhm.
made me wonder that that codicil specified that that apparently she signed, that she wanted a full Christian burial. And it was done after the will
Mhm.
she had done. And I'm just wondering if her devoted nephew, who was an heir to a big Christian missionary inheritance, maybe made that come about. But it was
I think
crazy that she would ask for
yeah,
that.
I think it's pretty obvious. Her last year, she had dementia at the best,
Okay.
and she didn't really know what she was doing from the
Okay.
last several years, and that's when that codicil was written. And
Okay.
I think it's pretty obvious that they just kind of pushed it at her. She really didn't know what she was signing, and so she ended up signing something that was definitely untrue.
Yes.
So, but
Yes. And
they
how
didn't
it
like
got
the idea of this
resolved
Baha'i
was
stuff.
great.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. How it got resolved was wonderful. And I was reading a little bit of the story to my husband, and he had a question, and he said, "Where did Agnes get her money?" All through.
well, when the first missionaries went to Hawaii, they were true Christian missionaries. Their children, however, learned about sugarcane and land, and they started getting rich. And of course, the children of those children inherited that wealth. So her money came from basically sugarcane. Um, all the missionaries basically ended up owning most of Hawaii and most of the business. And that's where her money came from, was from the
Yeah.
inheritance from them.
Okay. And the last question quickly, is there a recording of her voice? I know she did several radio programs, but I didn't.
There may be, I know there's a fellow in the Northern Ireland, Keith Monroe. He's been collecting all talks by Hands of the Cause. He may have something, but I don't know of anything off the top of my head.
Okay. Thank you so much.
And I looked and looked and looked for something, and I just couldn't find anything. I had the same thought you did, Mary Kay, that there must be some recording of her, but I couldn't find anything.
Oh, I'll ask
Yeah.
Keith next time I have a chance and see what he might have, and I can connect you with him. Maybe if
Yeah.
he
And that
has something.
comment, there's a comment in the latter part of the book that she had a penetrating voice.
Hmm.
Oh, and there's one more thing that was a gift. You know, we don't have much about the conclave of the hands after Shoghi Effendi passed away, the first conclave of the hands. And that part of the book where Agnes wrote her thoughts down about that conclave is, I've never read some of those things before. It's
Mhm.
pure gold. So I'm so happy that it was in the book.
Yeah.
let's
Thank
turn
you.
now to Susan Mojaverian and see what she can contribute. You're still muted at the moment, Susan. Thank you.
Hi, very well done with the Mojaverian. I just had a question about her family. Did any of the family ever become Baha'is? I wasn't sure if Mary ever became a Baha'i. I know they
One of her
traveled
cousins
together
became-
with Martha Root.
Yeah, one of her cousins became a Baha'i.
Okay.
Her sisters never did, but one of her cousins, Catherine Baldwin, became a Baha'i.
I
And
know
she was a
that
very
name.
she was a very dedicated Baha'i.
And did any of them review this book, or did you run this by them at all?
No.
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 So you haven't had any feedback from them since?
No, they're, the only ones that are alive are so far separated from her time-wise that, yeah, I don't know what they might say about it, but
Interesting. Jennifer. And you're muted.
Well, thank you for the book, Earl. I really enjoyed it. And one of my questions is, are there any examples, or I'm just looking at my notes here, it talks about how she taught, and are there any examples of any of her actual talks to the seekers, to the believers? And then the book also talks about her pilgrim notes that she shared as she traveled, and I just wondered if any of this material is actually available for us to read.
well, we have some of her pilgrimage notes. Her write-up about being on pilgrimage.
Right.
We have all of that. I'm not quite sure what she taught, but I know she really focused on Shoghi Effendi because a number of the people didn't realize the station that Shoghi Effendi held until after she came and told them about it. But there's a lot of stuff that isn't out there. Like, we don't have most of her talks. So what she really said is difficult. And not having done the research, I really can't say, because Dwayne did all of that. And I might have looked specifically for those sort of things if I'd gone to Wilmette. Of course, he did most of his research in Hawaii.
Right.
So,
Any of the newspaper articles that she appeared in, were you able to find or see any of those? Like in Japan or?
no, I didn't have access to those either.
Okay.
I might have done things differently had I written the book on my own research, but Dwayne had done all the research, and so we just moved from there.
Yeah. Well, it's wonderful. It's a beautiful book, so I'm not complaining. I just, I noticed in the notes for this group that her book about, I believe it's Japan, is available for us to read. Now, did she also write a book about Hawaii? I know the Guardian asked
She's
her
got
to
the
do
history
both.
of Hawaii. Those are both out there on the internet.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's a wonderful book.
Before we get to Nancy's question, we have a few things that have appeared in the chat. One person has done a little research using AI and found there's an audio recording of Agnes Alexander available from 1961, made in Menlo Park, California, as part of the Legacies of Service tape series produced by the Baha'i Publishing Trust in 1980. And the Baha'i Service of the Blind audio materials related to Agnes Alexander include recordings as well. But of course, we would have to check these notes to make sure that AI hasn't mistaken something. So we have that. And then we have two other questions. Pat has asked where she's buried.
She's buried in Hawaii, in Honolulu, in the family cemetery.
On top of her mother.
Yeah, on top of her mother, with her sister and brother at her feet. Yes.
They had to move the cremated remains around according to what you put in the book. That was very interesting. Very creative.
Yeah, that was quite an amazing thing, because the House of Justice was making phone calls and cables all the time, and I think the relatives were absolutely floored, the fact that the supreme body of the Baha'is was getting involved in the burial of their relative.
Yeah, they didn't appreciate her station, obviously.
Yeah.
And another comment by Rebecca: I am intrigued by the comment that, quote, focus was focused on white women, unquote. Can you comment about that?
Let's see.
I'm not sure where that quote comes from right offhand. She doesn't say.
Well, that's who she met most of the time, was white women. In Japan, she was meeting others. In Hawaii, it wasn't until later on that the natives got involved. So it was mostly the circle around her that she got involved with. In Japan, of course, it's the more Japanese, but she still did a lot of things with basically American and European women in Japan as well.
Mm.
But she did expand off of that, and of course, that was the divine assistance that kept connecting her with these different people.
Interesting. Nancy has a question, and you're muted, so be sure to unmute, please.
Hello.
Hi.
I sent in 3 questions. I'm not sure if they came through, but I can read them to you. They're on a little different tack. And one is from page 5. There was, do we know what other country whose name he stated but bade us conceal for the present? Has that come to light? On page 36, it was the quote from the letter Abdu'l-Baha sent to her, which we've said she did all the things that Abdu'l-Baha asked her. One of the things he asked her was to sing and chant and celebrate the name of thy Lord. Are there any accounts of her doing that, like singing and chanting or leading chanting? And the third question I was curious is page 88, Miroku is the return of Buddha. And I hadn't heard that term before. Can you tell us more about this? Is that Japanese Buddhism?
Like I said, I'm trying to find your stuff here.
I was also trying to imagine how these cables and mail followed her and Abdu'l-Baha and everybody all around the world. How did they send it to the cable office and, forward to this person or whatever? Like in our day of email, I'm it's hard for me to picture.
Well, she always left forwarding addresses when she would go from one place to the other. So when a
Okay.
cable would come into Japan, if she'd gone to Hawaii, they would know where to send it to in Hawaii.
Got you.
Yeah, I'm looking on page 88 trying to find this name you talked about. Oh yeah, the Miroku. I don't know anything more about that. It's just that's what it was called, the return of Buddha. So
It would seem to have become a popular character in a lot of Japanese anime as well, but presumably that's different.
And I can't remember what you said about page 5. You said something about page 5.
Yeah, there was, let me look at it.
There's a quotation from Shogi Fendi there.
Japan will turn ablaze, that one.
Mm-hmm.
Japan is endowed with the most remarkable capacity. And Japan, with parentheses, another country whose name he stated but bade us conceal for the present, will take the lead in spiritual reawakening of peoples and nations. So
yep. I'm not quite sure whether that could be China or possibly Australia, because Shogi Fendi later on talks about Australia and Japan being the arms that encircle the Pacific and gave them a leading role together in developing of the faith. So I'm not quite sure whether it would be them, but China also has something in the future too. So, but that's still in the future.
Yeah, whenever they say conceal it, it's like, okay, now I'm really curious.
Yeah. Then you had one other question, which I don't. What was the second question you had?
I think it was the one about, are there any stories of her singing and chanting?
Oh, singing and chanting. And off the top of my head, both Abdu'l-Baha and Shogi Fendi asked pilgrims to sing. And whether she did that at their request, I can't remember off the top of my head. I've got too many people that have sung.
Teaching Louise Waite's songs all over Japan.
Yeah.
So the Louise Waite's The Benediction.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For those who are interested in the chat, there's now a link to a recording of Agnes Alexander that Kathy found on the internet. So we can, after this, people can go listen to her if they want to. I'm looking to see what other questions we have here. Right offhand. I don't see any others.
I see Louis Burnett and Jennifer have hands up.
Oh, yes, please. Yeah, Louis.
I was just curious, Earl, is there a time when you write a book that you feel overwhelmed by things, whether it's the abundance of details and facts that you have, and it just becomes too much? And so if you reach such a point, how do you get out of that situation?
Well, I was just kind of in that. I'm just finishing a book on the Letters of the Living. And this was the suggestion of my editor. I've already done one on the knights and the apostles and the disciples. And she said, well, why don't you finish the ones who were titled?
Huh.
And that proved to be quite difficult structurally, because when you do like the knights, you just write a story about the knights. You write about the apostles, each chapter is a different apostle. But the letters were, half the time they're together. And so you can't write individual biographies for them. So you write individual things, then you have to kind of merge things. And then you're back to individual things as they go traveling around. And then 9 of them all are martyred at Sheikh Tabarsi. So you have to then go back together again. That was quite a challenge, trying to figure out how I was going to do that one. And Christine knows all about that. She's given me lots of good advice on how to make that work a little bit better. Yeah, but normally I just organize things really well. I organize everything by year. So I'll have a folder for a year, and I'll take every letter, every document I have, and if I have a date, I put the date on it. So it comes out in chronological order, and then I can just start building from there. So everything is, I try to get everything really highly organized before I even start. And then I can just pick a folder and start working from that folder. Everything's in chronological order, which I then have to start shoving around occasionally, but at least it gives me a place to start. So I've never gotten overwhelmed yet, although I have come to places where you start saying, what the heck am I going to do next?
Jennifer, please, if you have your comment.
Yes, Earl, I was wondering if you could comment on just the situation of Agnes being a woman alone, unmarried, traveling to these various parts of the world. How unusual was that at that time? And did she usually have a servant with her? I mean, I know at the end of her life, she talked about not having a servant and how so much of her life was taken up in just maybe things like cooking, But what was it like when she traveled? Did she usually have someone with her, and did she feel safe? She was often on public transport. There were other people around, but I thought still that was pretty unusual for that time, what she was doing. Could you comment on that some?
Well, Christine could probably talk about that too, because that's the same thing that Leonore Hosapple faced, going a young woman alone. But Agnes never really commented on in any of her letters. She never talked about being afraid of being places. She never learned Japanese. She just barely learned enough to do her shopping to travel. So that way I found that kind of fascinating, that she didn't come up with a language, but she just seemed to travel everywhere she needed to go and didn't have too much worries about it. Even there were some pretty difficult times, but
Did
so that
she
was a difficult
usually,
thing.
I'm sorry, did she usually have a servant with her when she traveled?
Not when she traveled. She had that lady go with her when she went to Japan, and then she would commonly have people like Mrs. Finch came over and stayed with her for a while. So she would have people stay with her, but then she would have, like when she first got there, the Augers were there, but in a different, she lived on her own, and then they moved to a different town, so she was the only one in Tokyo, and she just seemed to operate and had no real difficulties with that. She didn't seem to have a problem being in different cultures. She just went and did what she needed to do. But I think again that falls back on the same thing. She was just so tuned into divine assistance that she figured whatever she needed would happen.
Yeah, yeah. She was courageous, she was fearless, and she had the assistance. Yeah, very good.
Well, that's the thing about the early parts of the faith. I mean, Abdu'l-Bahá talks about that. The women were the ones who drove the faith around the world. You know, Leonora's book coming out with Leonora Hosapple and Mary Ann Jack and Imogene Hogue and Isabella Brittingham and you know, the list of women goes on compared to the list of men. So, you know, they were the fearless ones in the first century of the faith.
And I find it interesting that many of these women didn't marry, and the ones who did, or the thing where, was it May Maxwell? The thing about if you marry, bring your husband into the faith, so then you can be a teacher. You know,
Yeah.
I thought that was great.
Yeah. Well, a number of the ones that married were either, well, they lost their husband before they went out. Elizabeth Greenleaf, she was really in the shadow of her husband until he passed away, and then she blossomed. She went off and did amazing stuff after that. That was just the times. But Imogene Hogue, she was married to her husband, and he seemed quite happy to have her running around the world, you know, teaching the faith. She opened Italy up to the faith, and then when she passed away, that's when she really took off. She went to Alaska and she pioneered and stayed in Italy. So.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading more of your books. I tried to make a list as you were speaking, so thank you so much.
What else do we have? What other questions do we have?
Many of his books are available on the U.S. Baha'i Publishing Trust website, Baha'i Bookstore, and please use your member numbers to get a discount. I should add, as long as it's published by the Baha'i Publishing Trust. But George Ronald is also giving us a discount for some books, so please look at that.
But presumably you have to get that discount by ordering through George Ronald and not through the publishing trust.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Nancy. Yeah, you're still muted. There you go.
Find the unmute button. I was just really struck by her constant and total reliance on divine inspiration. And I have tried to emulate that in my own life. But also, I was struck that Abdu'l-Bahá did that when he went to Europe. You know, the Baha'is were like, oh, good, he's coming. We're planning his itinerary, you know, Monday there and Tuesday there and Wednesday there. And he got there and he was like, well, if God, inshallah, you know, when I wake up in the morning, he said, I seek divine guidance. And I thought, oh, okay. Because I used to be somebody who was very precise, planning everything, you know, the schedule. I wrote grants and you have to be, you know, here's the goal and here's how you're going to measure it and the outcomes and all that. And then as I got older and my brain wouldn't do that stuff anymore, it's more like, okay, well, I just call on the concourse then. So I just wanted to comment that it's a very different paradigm, and she wasn't the only one. I think maybe that confounded some of the planners of Abdu'l-Bahá's visits and trips. And maybe
that's something you just kind of get used to.
You know, in there.
If you're doing things for the faith, things change. Like we've done a lot of storytelling. And I usually set things up beforehand because we usually end up just hopping from place to place to place, and we have all these talks set up. But that happens in the prefix, the beginning times, as I'm setting these things up. I'll be sitting there and I'll be contacting some local spiritual assembly, and I think I'll have things more or less organized, and all of a sudden they'll come up and say, well, this other local assembly would really like you to come by here, and all of a sudden I'm squeezing in another talk at a different place. But you just kind of plan on you need that flexibility to do whatever God wants you to do. We make our own plans, but then sometimes they get changed. And we've ended up doing things radically different than I expected we'd be doing. And it's like these books, I have no idea what's going to come up next. And sometimes I'm quite flabbergasted as to what I end up writing because I had no idea that would ever do something like that. But I found some really fascinating stuff. So I think, and just a hint for a writer, find something that fascinates you and just follow it up. Because I've sure learned an awful lot of really interesting things and met some really fascinating people by writing about them. And write a book for yourself. Don't worry about whatever the people are going to think. Write a book that you wanted to read. And if you want to read it, there's probably going to be a few more people out there who'd like to read it too.
Hmm.
That's good advice. Go ahead, Susan. You're muted, of course. There you go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I really was taken with the account of the fire in the hotel in Japan. And again, her obsession with the trunk and her lamentation that she wasn't able to save her trunk, but she lost so much material that she of the writings that were apparently in that trunk, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that's what happens when life happens.
Yeah.
We try to make the best we can and you try to preserve all this stuff, but then things happen, and particularly in those days, you can't make quick copies of things like you can now. I've got all my books are on my computer. They're on a backup drive, which also has a backup drive, and they're also in the cloud. So, it isn't like in those days where you have a document that you have in your trunk.
Hmm.
Christine, go ahead.
Please excuse the funny frog in my throat today, but you were speaking about divine reliance on divine inspiration, and I was thinking of some conversations we've been having, my husband and I, about divine intercession. And I just thought I would describe an early on experience that I had with that when I was serving in Haifa. I happened to just meet right outside the little food center, Tahirzadeh. And he's been for years researching to write about his dad. And I think this topic came up, and I said, oh yes, I definitely ask my great aunt for help with the work that I'm doing. At the time it was mostly transcribing all the papers that I had found in my research, and was getting a lot of help for it there in Haifa. But in my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, I'll sit there and I'll think, oh, Aunt Leonora, please help me out. And he looked at me and he goes, do you really, really ask? I mean, he said, we need to beg for assistance. And I was a little bit, like, whoops, I'm sort of American conservative. And he was very effusive Persian in his descriptions of this. And he said, throw yourself on the floor and beg for assistance. And I was like, whoa. And then I realized that it's true. We're timid. We're timid about this. And I think if there's anything we can learn from reading these biographies of these early Baha'is, it's that they were out there on a thread. All of these things that we learn about Agnes Alexander, and what I learned about Leonora as well, is that they were dangling by a thread because they trusted Baha'u'llah was going to guide them at whatever point they needed it. The place where they didn't know what was going to come next.
Yeah.
So I thoroughly love all these little gems that Earl has dug up. They're fabulous. Thanks so much.
Louis Brunet, please.
I like the way you say that. Question, Earl, are any of your books being translated?
I have Visiting Abdu'l-Baha Volume 1 is in German. And The Knight's book has been translated into Kazakh, although not as a publishable book, but they just wanted to translate stories they're looking for sending out pioneers, and they wanted inspirational stories. So they've been translating my book. And Visiting Abdu'l-Baha Volume 1 has also been translated into Russian, but that's it at this point.
A good range of choices, actually. It's
I didn't choose them.
something. Yeah.
They just happened.
Yeah. Debbie Hirsch, please. And you're muted, Debbie. You're still.
So it only took me 30 minutes to figure out how to raise my hand. One thing I think I find this fascinating, and I find it very inspiring. And you stop and you think, well, what am I doing and where am I going? And I think we need to figure out a way to create maybe sort of an abridged version for people who are not going to read this entire thing, who really wouldn't even pick it up based on the size of it. Something that might appeal to teenagers in a way, because there's so much of this information that we don't need when we're 110. We need it when we're 18 and 19 and 20. And it just seems like we need to take a step further to make it more available. The other thing, the constant tablets from Abdu'l-Baha are amazing. And one thought I had was to find a tablet that he had written to someone else and think about, I really resonate with this tablet. I like this. What is it I could do in my life to begin to even live up to that tablet? That we take a tablet as an inspiration kind of thing. And so I thought that might be an interesting thing to do. And yeah, the constant theme we've had over and over, the fact that she is constantly, somebody in the book mentioned, of all her wonderful attributes, in my opinion, her most outstanding attribute was her absolute obedience to the will of God. She believed implicitly that she would be guided unerringly if she turned her heart and mind to Baha'u'llah in prayer. The person says, I was reminded of the words of Baha'u'llah in the Seven Valleys, a servant is drawn unto me in prayer until I answer him, and when I have answered him, I become the ear with which he heareth. So that just kind of sums up the whole thing that she did. I'm done.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. I think that's a great summary of Agnes Alexander. What other comments and questions do we have? Anything in particular? Go ahead, Nancy. And you're muted, of course.
Okay. Well, I was thinking all the way reading through, how did she do all this, opening these countries and all the things that we're supposed to do? She did individual home visits. When she went to a country, she found out who the believers were or the seekers, and she went to them personally. And then she gave talks wherever she was invited, even though she didn't have a lot of experience initially. She joined some of these other organizations, like-minded organizations, like the Esperantists, the Societies for the Blind. So she was active in the wider community. And yeah, she relied on divine assistance, but there was also a whole lot of practical stuff that she did. Put articles in the newspaper. So these are all things that we can do,
Bringing up Esperanto is interesting because she learned Esperanto early on, not having any idea what she'd need it for, but just because Abdu'l-Baha suggested was something that Baha'i should study. And of course, that's what opened up Japan. She had that blind Vasily that she met, and that opened up Japan because getting together with blind people, several of the early Baha'is were blind. So Vasily never became a Baha'i, but that led him to people who did become Baha'is. And that was just because Abdu'l-Baha suggested that people learn Esperanto, and she decided, okay, I have to do that then. So, but it's
Well,
this thing you just do what you feel you're being asked to do, and that's all sorts of pathways open up for that. So,
yeah, and now the House of Justice is asking us to participate in the discourses of society, to interact with the wider community, but she was doing that back in the day.
mhm.
It might be worth mentioning to people that there is a Baha'i Esperanto League that still exists, and they meet, I think, once a month for devotions, though it's at 6 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, I believe. It's a good time for people in Europe, but not particularly for people in North America.
Yeah.
But I have their email address if anyone wants to be in touch with them.
I might toss one other little interesting side effect thing out of here. Um, we all know, everybody knows Fujita. He was from Japan. Abdu'l-Baha's and Shoghi Effendi's uh, great servant. But when he was sent back to Japan before World War II, he couldn't stay in Japan. He had to go out and teach. So he went to Taiwan. And so far as I understand, he was the first Baha'i to go to Taiwan to teach the faith. So he went from Taiwan, then to China, and then finally back to Japan again.
I'll see if I can find the Esperanto link while I'm at it. I'm not sure I can find it while we're still here.
So nice that you mentioned Fujita, because of course so many of us had the joy of knowing him and of interacting with him, and it was just he was such a lovely, wonderful person. So I
I
think
can say I've written a short book on him. It's too short to, they almost didn't publish it, but then they said if I put lots of pictures in, they would.
Uh-huh.
So I'm looking for anybody who has interesting stories of Fujita. Let me know. I'd love to
yeah,
have them.
I can definitely tell you some.
Good.
So I think, Rob, those are all of the questions, and what a wonderful discussion about this incredible, incredible hand of the cause, Ms. Alexander. I just wanted to let everyone know that we're reading one of my favorite books, God Loves Laughter, for the month of March. I know many of us have read it, so we'll be rereading it. And I'm hoping that Robert Malouf will join us on Sunday, March 30th at 2 o'clock to read excerpts from it. And since so many of us knew Mr. Sears, that I'm hoping we can tell stories, and it'll just be such a joyful, joyful time to remember him and to read this fantastic book. Rob, did you want to tell us a little bit about the upcoming programs at the Corinne True Center?
I can mention a couple of things. We have a course on Buddhism, which starts on March 2nd or 3rd. And it's going to be quite an interesting course because we're going to look at Buddhist teachings from a Baha'i perspective and do a comparison. So that's a particular course that's very interesting, I think, for people, and we're looking forward to get that one getting started. Then towards the end of March, we have Arabic 3. But to take Arabic 3, you have to have had Arabic 1 and 2 or the equivalent. We also have 2 webinars coming up in March, and both of them focus on Tahare. There was a volume academic volume of a journal called Hawa, a journal of women in the Middle East and the Islamic world, which focused on Tahare, and there were 7 talks, 7 papers about Tahare by Baha'is published in that particular journal. So we're going to have on the 16th and unfortunately the 30th of March, we're going to have 3 speakers each talk about their papers that were published in that volume. And you can go to CorinneTrueCenter.org. Corinne, no, I didn't quite spell it right. Let me fix that. CorinneTrueCenter.org, our website, and you can click through to the courses tab or to the webinar tab to find more information about these particular programs. The webinars, of course, will be recorded and up on our YouTube channel, as are the book club recordings. The recordings of the book club, we don't put the information about this link up live. Only the members of the book club can come to the live discussion, but the recordings are eventually put up so that people can watch those as well.
And of course, you remember that we are reading about Tahira in April. We're reading the book Rejoice in My Gladness, The Life of Tahira by Janet Roux-Schoen. So March and April will be wonderful to focus on Tahira, this incredibly brilliant woman. I think that's it for us.
One other thing I should mention also is that the Corinne True Center for Baha'i History is going to be doing a conference at Greenacre, June 6th through the 8th, on Baha'i history, theology, the study of Baha'i texts, and the Baha'i approach to other world religions and scriptures. And we are still putting together the program, but it looks like we only have room for 12, maybe 12 talks, and it looks like I've got like 25 possibilities. We're quite amazed by the response that we've gotten from people. We may have to plan a second conference as well. So we have really quite a bounty of presentations on all kinds of topics related to the faith that will be given at Greenacre starting Friday evening, the 6th of June, through Sunday noon, the 8th, and also up on our website. If you look, you'll find a link for the Greenacre conference. It's listed as Greenacre 2025. There, if you click on go down to conferences, it'll pop right up for you.
So exciting. I'm really hoping that I can attend. And I'm taking the course on the writings of Baha'u'llah that Rob Stockman is teaching, and it's incredible. Our last conversation, Rob, was like a master class on world religions. I just learned so much from you in that session. So thank you so much for that. So interesting. So let me thank Earl again. Let me give you the last word, and then we'll say goodbye.
Well, I'll have many last words. Glad you enjoyed the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, and thank you everyone for attending our book club meeting. Happy reading.
Thank you so much, all of